My name is Lancaster Coolidge. I had ridden aimlessly across the West for 2.5 years before I came to Bullock, Montana, which was just a low, cruel plain without anything to mark it or remember its certain eventual demise. 2.5 years, and I was tired to my bones. So tired that even a place like Bullock seemed desirable for a time of rest. I rode Linden there on an October day when a snowstorm seemed to be approaching, but thinking back, it never did come. Not then, anyway. The sun had just gone down when I made my way along the town's biggest of its 4 musty streets. I tied Linden and went into a place called Morgan's Inn. I was the only one in there. It wasn't much of a bar. At least I was pleased to see a woman tending it. Her name was Eva. There wasn't much to do but drink their weak gin and be grateful for the fire, so we passed an hour, maybe 2, talking. She walked some water out to Linden, and she was kind enough to drape a blanket over him. With the dark, it got bitterly cold. She told me her story, I told her mine. I had not much money left, but she was able to recommend a very cheap room. There was work 2 towns over, if I wanted it, but I wasn't even sure about that. She was too young to understand the weariness in the heart that comes with not seeing any good options, any paths that wouldn't demand more energy of spirit than I had anymore. She asked me if I was a church-going man. I said no. But I asked her about one I'd seen about 5 miles out, in the middle of the plain, all by itself, a ramshackle building, unmarked. Eva became quiet then. She said it was best not to ask too many questions about that place, especially here in Bullock. And that just made me more curious. She seemed to look around to make sure no one else was listening, as if anyone else had even come into the place since I had. 4 years before, the priest whose church that had been passed away, and the place had fallen into disrepair, neglected. Then one day someone saw a man ride in and explore it, and that man had never left. He'd never come as far as Bullock, nor had he ever entered Pisgah Town, as far as anyone knew. He moved into the tiny quarters behind the church, and there he stayed. No one knew what the man was doing, but then it wasn't often that someone went by. The road to the church had become so muddy and washed out that traders didn't take it anymore. What people gleaned from the goings-on there came from a view of the hills nearby, mostly. One day in March, someone noticed that the sign outside the church had been relettered by hand. It announced that services would take place Sundays, Tuesdays, and Thursdays. But the pastor, if that's who the man was who had taken up residence there, did not add his name. No posters ever appeared in Bullock. So at first, nobody went to the church. No one. The terrible condition of the road, the strangeness of the man living alone, the deep roots that were there with the previous pastor, it all put people off, so they simply didn't go. Eva had been out that way one night. She was evasive about why. I sensed it was because she was with someone she wasn't supposed to be. But she said it had been on a Thursday, and it was dark out, and she'd watched as the lamps were lit inside the church, and she'd seen the man begin to hold a service. But it was obvious he was the only one inside the place. Eva said he could be seen speaking from the pulpit to rows of empty pews. He wore a priest's collar and spoke so loudly that, even from far away, Eva thought she could hear his voice carried to her by the wind. He seemed to be about 50 years old, very thin, pale. As weeks passed, people in Bullock began to talk about this priest who held services whether anyone showed up or not. and to everyone's knowledge, no one ever had. Sometimes someone would ride by on a Sunday and consider entering, but move on. The people who had begun to go to services in Pisgah Town after Father Umney had died kept on with their new church, rather than return to the one some had known since they were children. And out on the plain, the priest lit the lamps 3 times a week and spoke his sermons to no one. He had never set foot in Bullock, it was said, but it wasn't clear where he got his rations or stores. He had 3 animals with him, and he tended to them, but that couldn't have been enough to subsist on. And then, after a time, Eva told me, the reason no one went to the church was less about inconvenience and unfamiliarity as it was about superstition. Some people said the priest must be mad. But when you mentioned him in Bullock, you were just as likely to hear the word haunted. People stayed away because the priest and his strange compulsion to relentlessly perform services in an empty church frightened people. He would be there tomorrow afternoon, Eva said, for his Tuesday service, and if I got close enough, as some had, I'd be able to hear his booming voice teaching the gospel, just as he had hundreds of times now. It didn't seem possible to me that no one had ever even spoken to this man. But Eva believed it to be true. I said, well, I believe I may have to speak to him myself. And at this suggestion, Eva's eyes went wide, and her generosity went cold. Please don't think about that, she said. And to be kind, I assured her I was only joking. I'd heard stranger tales in the past 2.5 years of wandering, yes. I'd met a blind woman who could mimic any voice so perfectly it sent chills down the spine. And I'd heard of a man who burst into flames as he was taken to the gallows to be hanged. But this story compelled me in a way I couldn't really describe. I thought about it all night in my lonely bed in Storch's guest rooms, and then I dreamed about it. After so many days and weeks and months of having nothing to obligate me to even rise in the morning, I was anxious to ride out to the church, if only out of a sense of mystery. I bode my time in Bullock by playing cards with a man reeking of whiskey. And at 3 o'clock the next day I mounted Linden, and we rode out as Bullock settled into a late afternoon stupor. I saw only 2 people on the streets as I left, a man and woman bickering over the weatherproofing of their house as they walked along, eyeing me suspiciously. My memory didn't serve me very well as I made my way out to the church, and I got disoriented not once but twice. How my mind had atrophied, without challenges, without ambitions, without desires. But that is what war can do to you. I'll say nothing more about my past. I believe it was 3:30 when I saw the church in the distance. A half hour till services, apparently. There was no sun that day. The sky was a nasty gray. Linden and I stood looking down on the place, and after about 15 minutes, the priest emerged from his one-room shack. He shooed a pig away from the front door, and for a time, he merely gazed at the sky above him, his back straight, his neck craned back. I could just see that he wore a clerical collar. He entered the church, and I rode Linden closer to it, very slowly. Eva had been right about the road. It had become almost impassable marsh in places, so we avoided it. And yes, I did spy glimpses of the priest through the filthy windows, lighting the lamps. And then I did hear him speak, though I never got to within less than 50 yards of the place. The sound carried on the wind. He was reciting a passage from, I don't know what part of the Bible. All alone, His voice was full of bass and unusual power. He spoke as if his audience was in the hundreds. It was hypnotic. I had to force myself to turn away. I'd established nothing more than that Eva's tale was true. Dreams of the church came to me each night for the next 3 as I began my sad existence in the forgotten town of Bullock, playing cards, reading, tending to my old friend Lyndon, and drinking when I knew Eva would be at Morgan's Inn. I preferred talking to her to the few other patrons. Out of respect for her, I didn't mention the church again, and talked of other things. If she and I ever had a chance to become more than customer and barkeep, I try not to think about it. It seemed neither one of us had enough of a fire inside us to pursue it. Though I am still young, and she was only 24. Something must have happened to her. Long ago, I think now. I have a sense for that. On Saturday, at dusk, I stopped at Morgan's Inn for bourbon just before heading out of town for the evening. Eva seemed to know as soon as I walked in what I had planned. "Don't go there," she pleaded to me. I tried to explain that it could be my last chance to find what I needed. I'd never accepted the Lord, but maybe that one voice could bring me to that place. A voice as lonely as I had been since I left the army. Maybe one man who was like me, speaking to me, like a brother. Someone who possibly needed me. Maybe that was my chance to perceive the high ground and the glory. When I left Eva, I pressed $2 into her palm, and I felt that her hand was shaking. The wind battered me as I rode north, finding my way carefully in the dark, never urging Lyndon at more of a trot. He'd stuck by me for so long, and now he was developing a weak leg and a strong dislike for the cold. The sky was clear, the stars were brilliant. I got more confused than I thought, and I wound up approaching the church from due south. All I could see as I moved closer was its tall entrance, shut tight against the cold. The only way I could tell the lights were aglow was by the fog they put out through the side windows. I tied Lyndon and I walked slowly to the tall doors, and I hesitated. I listened for any movement inside, but I couldn't sense any. I saw Eva's face in my mind. And then came my mother's face, a vision whose origin baffled and frightened me. I hadn't thought of her for a long, long time. And in my mind, she was crying. "Mama," I thought, "why are you crying?" "I'm going to church, finally. I'm going to church." But at these words, she turned away. I pushed the doors inward. The tiny church was indeed fully lit. But I was not alone. Not at all. The pews were filled with people. None turned to note my entrance. They faced the pulpit where the tall, skinny priest stood, ready to begin. But where had the people come from? For there were no horses tied outside other than Lyndon. None. I took a seat at the very, very back, trying to be silent and respectful. The priest began the service. He spoke of how hard life could be, whether one was a farmer, a doctor, a prospector, a soldier. We created such lofty goals, all of us, to distract us from the only one that mattered in the end, the desire for peace at the close of that long journey. peace that was here in the house of God for those willing to submit. How lonely it was, and how foreign was every town on every dusty plain for those who turned away, who would not accept the light. The priest asked for a moment of quiet in which each parishioner asked him or herself, "Am I resisting? Is it not time for me to go?" But when the silence began, the parishioners didn't bow their heads. They turned, all of them, to the back of the church, to me. Their eyes locked on me. None of the faces were familiar. None of them held friendship, love, or comfort. "If you will not rest, sir," the priest said from the pulpit, "if you insist on going on, we must at least have your animal." It was a demand and a threat, and I wasn't strong enough to resist entirely. And so I got up and left the church alone, leaving Lyndon behind. Lyndon, who had been so faithful, even to the moment when an enemy bullet felled him underneath me, 2,000 miles away from Bullock. I walked away, leaving him hitched. Yes, they could have Lyndon, but not me. I was exhausted and depleted to the marrow of my spine, but I was not ready for death itself. No matter how deeply they may have buried my broken corpse in Mexico, on the day the bullets had struck me too. I walked toward the west all night, freezing, hungry, and having no reason to go on, but go on I will, until someone more powerful than that priest emerges to overcome me. Sometimes I think the longer I resist to the very end, the more sinister that someone will be, and the darker the place he will take me. I am in Idaho now, in a small town called Proud. I grow weaker by the day, and there are moments when it seems the people on the street do not even see or hear me. But death itself cannot have me. I don't want to die. Can you understand that? Here, friend, let me buy you a whiskey, and we can sit by the fire and discuss it. I want to ask you again. Can you understand?